It's not your fault. It's Jeff's fault. It really is Jeff's fault. Just because you have an eyewitness doesn't mean that it's accurate. And that's exactly what happened here. In his defense, Johnson's hair did not match a pubic hair found at the scene, and 4 witnesses, they gave Johnson an alibi for the time of the crime. So 4 people said that he didn't do it. 4 people said that he was with them, or they saw him when the crime was committed. The pubic hair that they found at the scene did not match his pubic hair. But he was convicted anyway. Of course he was convicted anyway, because there was an eyewitness that said that he was the one that did it. The eyewitness had implicated Johnson from a photographic lineup, even though she failed to pick him out of a live lineup. In other words, she identified him by the picture, by the photograph, but she couldn't pick him out of a lineup. So live, she didn't recognize him, but as in a picture, she did recognize him. We're going to find out something about African Americans that most people don't understand. I know this is exciting. You're going to find out something about white people that most people don't even recognize. Won't this be exciting? At trial, she claimed that she chose someone else in the live lineup because she couldn't stand to look at Johnson. So she picked somebody else. She didn't want to look at him because he scared her. DNA proved that Johnson was innocent, of course. Not only that, but they had that pubic hair, and it was somebody else's pubic hair. 4 people gave him an alibi. Was that strong enough? No, he was convicted anyway. And eventually, of course, he was released from prison. You'd think you'd be really upset. Most people getting out of prison aren't. Prison is so noxious that they're just happy to get out. They're not mad at anybody. They just want to get out. Anyway, I know, this is exciting. Another black guy. Okay, here we go. Cornelius Dupree was accused of robbing a couple and then raping the woman in 1979. He was sentenced to 75 years in prison. He robbed somebody and raped somebody, or at least that was the accusation. And they gave him 75 years in prison for rape and robbery. It seems kind of extreme to me, I don't know. Maybe you guys don't agree with me, but 75 years is a long time for rape.
Was he padded for anything else?
I'm sorry?
Like, was he charged for more stuff?
No. Nope, just rape and robbery. That's enough. At 2 junctures during his incarceration, he was offered parole if he admitted his crime. He refused. What an idiot. He could have gotten out. All he had to do was say, I did it. But he refused. In 2000, after 30 years in prison, Dupree was exonerated through DNA evidence of the crime. When asked why he didn't take the parole, Dupree said, whatever the truth is, you have to stick with it. And he lived in prison for 30 years. He spent most of his life in prison because the truth is more important than not being in prison, I guess. That's how he felt anyway. I don't know that I agree with him. What do you think? Should you admit to something that you didn't do just to get out of jail? That's the way the criminal justice system works. Would you do it?
Depending if Katy Perry's on having a concert.
You know she's got blonde hair now.
Even better.
I'm so upset that her hair's not black. Okay. I always look at her hair. That's what I'm focusing on. Okay. Would you do it? Stay in jail or get out? All you have to do is admit that you did it. And you didn't do it. Would you do it?
It depends. It depends on whether if the person that really is the perpetrator is close to me or not.
But you don't know who the perpetrator is.
Let's just say
You were just accused of something you didn't do. You had no alibi, you had no excuse, and so they convicted you because they just convicted you. So do you admit that you did it even though you didn't do it just to get out of jail?
I would.
You would?
No.
No?
I would, definitely, just because I have a family, I don't wanna.
Kids are
spend
more
my
important
time-
than,
Yeah. God will judge.
yeah, sure, why not? No? You wouldn't do it? Stay in jail for 30 years? You want to stay in jail for 30 years?
I think I make my way up to the top in jail, so that'd be okay.
You know, mean people are that way.
You gonna be selling cigarettes?
They're kind of scary. Wow, Brandon just got, would you do it?
I know you would.
I'd say like,
Would you stay in prison if they agreed to let you out, but you had to admit that you did something you didn't do?
No.
You had
No.
to confess, in other words. You
No.
wouldn't do it?
No.
Stay in jail for 30 years?
It's just what they want. Like, the whole
You have to do what the man wants.
Yeah, that's the whole system. That's how it's worked against people of color, I would say.
Okay, okay.
I'd stay in jail.
Stay in jail
Because
too?
I'd stick by my principles, not just that, but my quality of life. I mean, either way, it's gonna be screwed.
Oh, yeah, it's a
You
good
know,
point.
so
Yeah.
either way, if I really didn't do it, heck yeah, I'd bite the bullet and I'd stand by my own grounds and
Okay.
wait just like you did.
Okay.
I'd stay in jail.
You don't want to stay in jail too? My goodness gracious. I don't want to stay in jail. What'd you do, Edison? Say it. Truth shall set you free. It may take 30 years, but truth shall set you free. Of course, if you're, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. It all depends on what's going on in prison. Of course, I'm the leader in prison. I want to stay in jails because it's so much fun. Approximately 750,000 defendants are implicated by eyewitnesses in the United States every year, 75,000. But unfortunately, some eyewitnesses make mistakes. Not very many, but some of them make mistakes. People look alike. People, if they've never seen you before, they may not remember you very well. Can you remember people just by seeing them one time? Sometimes you get people mixed up. Especially people of a different race. Do all black people look alike to you? Do all white people look alike to you? Do all Hopi look alike to you? Do all, I don't know. Do all bell nappers look alike to you? Michelle just walked
All guys that drive Miatas look the same to me.
in. Do all professors look alike to you? Can you get me mixed up with Marius? You know, that happened. That's happened to me a couple of times.
Yeah.
I know, people thought I was Marius.
Are you?
No. No. All white professors look alike. Of course, Marius is.
That's why I giggled.
Yeah, I know. Okay. DNA testing sometimes reveals that the person convicted of a crime was not the actual perpetrator. This does happen. Recent estimate, about 80% of the exonerations for rapes and robberies involve mistaken eyewitness identifications. 80%, that's a lot. You've only seen this person one time. That's one of the reasons why they have all those marks on the wall at 7-Elevens and whatnot, so you can tell how tall the bad guy was. You can say, oh, he's 6'4", you know, that kind of thing. I always try to be taller when I walk in, you know, get up on my tiptoes so that I can actually be 5'7" instead of 5'6"3/4. It's depressing. One reason why mistakes are so common is that when eyewitnesses make an identification, police often stop investigating other leads and instead look for further evidence that implicates the chosen suspects. And we see this on television all the time. The reality is that's the way it works. If you have somebody in jail, you don't have to worry about investigating the crime anymore. But it's over with. You've got somebody, and potentially, of course, you wouldn't put them in jail unless they're going to be convicted. Because you have to have enough evidence against them to put them in jail to begin with. This is an example of confirmation bias, whereby people look for, interpret, and create information that verifies an existing belief. And of course, that's not the way you're supposed to do it. You're supposed to be open-minded about these things. But if you've already got a suspect, you're trying to prove that suspect, you're looking for evidence to prove that suspect is guilty. And that's known as confirmation bias. The police aren't supposed to do this. But most policemen are not psychologists. Most policemen have never taken this class. They don't understand this stuff. Most policemen are not geniuses. They don't have IQs in the 130 to 160 range. Otherwise, they'd be college professors. I'm kidding. College professors have Asperger's. Almost every damn single one of them is, oh, it's all
Or
taken.
OCD.
Only 27 states have laws that compensate the wrongly imprisoned. So if I arrest somebody, throw them in jail for 30 years, do they get anything for it? The answer is only in
Free food.
the cases. I'm sorry?
Free food.
Free food, there you go. You got the 3 hots in a cot, what are you complaining about? In 23 states out of 27, they don't get jack. Financial compensation is generally very small, and several social service assistance is rare, depending on the state. And now that it looks like, well, now that they've decided not to do away with the Affordable Care Act, again, I guess, I'm not exactly sure. And it looked like they were going to cut welfare in select states. But we're not exactly sure what's going to happen now. So social services, they're still out there, but this administration doesn't really support social services like the Obama administration did. So we're not exactly sure what's going to happen next. And every state is different. You know, Arizona is different from New Mexico. Arizona and New Mexico are different from California and Colorado. So you just never know. Colorado's having problems right now because there are a lot of people that are migrating to Colorado, immigrating. They're moving to Colorado to smoke pot, and unfortunately, pot smokers aren't the best workers in the whole wide world. Anyway, I'm talking about that. So they're having problems. It's really kind of interesting. A lot of these individuals are trying to go on welfare, and of course they're changing their welfare laws in Colorado. Fascinating to watch. I'm not sure one of the guys doing it. Mistakes in the process of identification can occur the moment the crime is committed. Situational conditions such as how dark was it? Can we identify this individual? Is that a male or a female? Do we know what this person is? They've got long hair, obviously, but that doesn't mean that they're a female. Could it be a slender male? Could be. Can we look at their long fingers and say, oh, only a chick has long fingers? No, we can't do that. No, we really can't do that. And it's dark. And the problem is, of course, we see things and we immediately forget it because it's not important. So if I see somebody walking down the street, and then I find out that this person murdered somebody, can I identify them? Well, probably not, because I didn't put it in my long-term memory. It was in my short-term memory, it was in my working memory, and then it was gone. Last night I covered Wilson's class at 6 o'clock. I know, I covered his class at 6 o'clock. So I was there from like 6:15 until 6:45. I'm a good boy, I stayed there. But I saw this lady. This lady came in and signed in, and then I saw her downstairs, I think. I don't know. I'm never going to see that. Well, maybe I'll never see this lady again. She signed her name, but I don't know if that's the lady I actually saw walking past me. Her clothes looked about the same. People need to always wear the same clothes so that I can identify, well, pink. Stephanie's got on pink, so I know if I see somebody in pink, it must be Stephanie because Stephanie wears pink. Yeah, nobody else wears pink.
Never mind the female that was wearing pink.
Exactly.
On that side.
And this lady had on gray last night, so everybody wears gray. This is kind of depressing. It could have been you. No. It could have been you. No. It wasn't you. It could have been no. She was taller than you are. Okay. Mistakes can also occur during the investigation. Police often ask eyewitnesses to examine a series of photos, and this is known as a photo spread, by the way, or a physical lineup of suspects. So you can look at photographs, you can look at suspects. One of the things these are all African American males. You may notice that they're all African American, probably. There is a way to identify that African Americans identify each other. And we're going to talk about that in just a second. Eyewitnesses may feel implicit pressure to identify someone and are likely to assume that the perpetrator is in the lineup. But they don't tell you that. You don't know if they're in the lineup or not. So are you looking for the person that is the closest to what you remember this person is looking like? And that's what people do all the time. They identify the person that is the closest to what this person looked like. Although accurate identifications are more likely than inaccurate identifications, we know that innocent people are sometimes selected and guilty people are sometimes overlooked. Can you identify the race of this select individual? If somebody asks you, well, what ethnicity was this select individual? And he looked like that, what would you say? Is he black, white? Is he Hispanic? Is he native? He's what? Iranian? He's Iranian? He looks like a Persian to you?
Yeah.
Does he look Persian?
Looks Persian. He looks like he's from Alabama.
Oh, man. Well, let's look at his hair. What kind of hair? Well, we can't really see his hair very well.
Looks like John.
Somebody stole the chair. You want me to help you find one? Yeah. Here, let me carry it for you. Okay. This guy's Hispanic. Sorry. I just thought I could ask you. Oh yeah, he's Hispanic. But they kind of look like Persians, don't they? Yeah. He could be Persian. We call them Iranians. If you're over there, you call them Persians. And, guns can make you excited. Certain variables can affect how we will take in information. We have what we refer to as the weapon focus effect. The weapon focus effect is if a weapon is present when a crime is committed, we may devote more attention to it than to the facial features of other physical aspects of the person with the weapon. I've told you about some of the times I've come in contact with people that were carrying weapons. I told you about the guy with a Nerf gun that I thought was an M9 machine gun. It wasn't, but it could have been. And I had a plan as to how I was going to keep him from shooting me. That was I came up with a plan. All this is zipping through my brains as it was happening. I was focused on the gun. I couldn't tell you what the guy looked like. I know he was white. And he had black hair. And he looked like he was young, but I really couldn't pick him out of a lineup. Why? Because I was focused on his weapon. I was trying to figure out if that was real or whether it was not real. That's known as weapon focus effect. So anytime somebody has a weapon, you're more likely to keep an eye on the weapon to see it, whether it moves from one side to another, whether it's pointing at you. You're more focused on that than you are on somebody's facial features. The presence of a weapon can also affect the processing of auditory information. If somebody confronts you and they don't have a weapon, then you may look them in the face, you may remember what's going on, you're trying to figure out, well, you know, Sheldon is about to pop me in the nose, Can I run fast enough to get away from him? The answer is no, in Sheldon's case. Maybe I can get close enough to him that he can't hit me very hard. These are all the things I'm thinking about, but if he's got a knife, he can kill me. It's gonna take him a while to beat me to death, but he can kill me with a knife. Or if he's got a gun, it just takes one shot. If he gets a lucky shot off, and I'm not moving, then he may just pop me right in the heart and I'm a dead man. If it's a gun, so I have to look at where that barrel is pointed. Isn't that the way it works? If it's a knife, I've got to gauge how quickly he can get between me and him. See, I wrote something on my hand that's going already. I know. This is my note to myself. Anyway, okay, so if it's a knife, I've got to gauge how quickly he's going to get to me so that he can stab me, right? So I'm focused on the weapon, I'm not focused on his face. I don't really care about what's going on in his face. Now, somebody that's trained, is anybody military trained? If you're military trained, you're trained to look them in the eye and to use your peripheral vision to gauge where you're military. They trained you to do this, right? Okay. Yeah, you're trained to look in their faces. Rather than the weapon, you use your peripheral vision to gauge where the weapon is, whether it's pointing at you or not. But most of us aren't trained to do, you have to be trained because it's scary as hell. Weapons are really scary because they can do a lot of damage to you and they can kill you really quickly. So normally we're focused on the weapon rather than the person's face. But of course the military trains you not to do that. The police train you not to do that as well. Weapon focus effect appears to be caused by selective attention. We have limited attentional capacity. Your brain can think of one thing at a time. I'm sorry, it can only think of one thing at a time. Even if you're paying attention to your peripheral vision, as they train you to do in the military, you can still only do that one thing at a time. You can only think of the one thing. So you can gather information, and that's what's happening with your peripheral vision. You're gathering information, and potentially at some point, for a nanosecond, you're going to be thinking about what you are observing in your peripheral vision. Does all this make sense? Okay. It's not easy. Sometimes it takes a while to learn all these things. Okay, there are 3 stages of memory: encoding, storage, and retrieval. And of course, we're trying to get information out of somebody's memory. So we have to understand that you have to encode the information, you have to store the information, and you have to get that information out. So in order for me to remember what Jeff looks like, I have to look at his face and encode that information. I have to put it in my brain so I recognize him when I see him walking down the hall. And of course, if he changes his sweatshirt from Texas to Maryland or something, then I'm SOL. I have to store that information, then I have to get that information out of my brain somehow. I have to find it. Now, you guys, I've lectured you, and all of a sudden I can't think of a word. Have you noticed that? So every once in a while, I do. It doesn't happen that often, okay, Brian? It doesn't happen that often. But sometimes I can't come up with a word, or I can't come up with a concept. The problem is that my retrieval cues are inaccurate. I'm not using the right retrieval cues. And then, of course, I get all flustered, and I'll say something like, I'll think of that name in just a minute. If I stop thinking about it, maybe it'll come to my memory. That's how I'm trying to retrieve the information. Okay, so we code stuff, we store that information, and we retrieve that information. Stimuli that are only briefly seen or heard cannot be encoded fully. The complexity of a stimulus also affects its encoding. How complex is it? What are we looking at? Are we looking at one specific thing? Are we trying to encompass everything? Extreme stress usually causes the person to encode information incompletely or inaccurately, and this is the problem. So if I'm really scared, shitless, as we say sometimes, not very often, sometimes we say that. If I'm really scared, then I'm not going to put that information in my brain very well at all. I'm not going to remember things. I'm not going to remember what somebody looks like. Does all that make sense? Okay. So my encoding is inaccurate. My encoding may be totally incomplete. I may have weapon effect focus. I may be focusing on the weapon rather than on the person's face. A lot of times what happens with an individual that has been raped, especially if they are threatening the individual with a weapon, they can't remember the guy's face at all. Now you would think that, you know, they're having sex, you would think that they would remember what this guy looked like, they would remember things about him, but if there's a weapon involved, a lot of times they don't remember the guy at all. And of course, at the same time, they're trying to forget him. Witness characteristics can affect coding. For example, the effects of stress are felt more acutely by those higher in anxiety and neuroticism. Okay, so an old fart like me, I've been through a whole hell of a lot, so things don't bother me nearly as much. It's easy for me to say, oh, come on, you know, you don't have to be neurotic, you don't have to be overly anxious. But the reality is that, you know, I'm almost dead. I'm almost 68 years old. Who knows, I could have a heart attack next week. And you guys would go, yeah, he was pretty damn close. I could tell just by looking at him, he was close to being gone. Anyway, but there are a lot of individuals that are real sensitive to these things. And of course, the more sensitive you are to it, the more likely that you're going to encode the information inaccurately. Okay. The other thing is I'm military trained. So I'm trained to be a cold-hearted SOB, just a minor. And I was a medic, so that also makes me a cold-hearted SOB. Far as that goes. So I've been in a lot of strange situations. But if you've never been in a situation like this, if you've never been threatened or stabbed with a knife, I hope nobody's been stabbed with a knife but me, or shot. I was shot when I was a kid. You know. Evidently there's something wrong with me. People want to, you know, do damage to me. It's really kind of tragic. And I've actually been, people have pointed a hairdryer. Yeah, thank you. I couldn't think of the word. A hairdryer at me. We all differ in visual acuity and hearing ability. The reality is I have pretty good eyesight. I can hear fairly well. I have tinnitus. But the reality is I do hear and I see fairly well. I don't wear glasses. I only wear glasses to read. This is my cowboy shirt, so it's got one of those loops on it so I can hang my glasses from. Anyway, but some people wear contacts. Some people wear glasses. And if you don't have your glasses on, how well can you see? Glasses, no glasses? Perfect eyesight, 2020, 2010? I'm sorry?
Contacts.
Oh, you have contacts. Contacts, glasses, contacts? No. So you have perfect eyesight. It's really kind of tragic. I'm probably uglier to you than everybody else in the room. Johnny wears glasses, of course. I can't remember if Tiffany wears glasses. I don't think she does. She doesn't have glasses on. Jeff's got glasses on. I'm sorry?
Waiting for my glasses.
Oh, you're waiting for your glasses. So I look pretty good to you. I'm kind of fuzzy and blurry. Yeah. You know, I'm a lot more attracted to people who can't see very well. That's why I always never try to kiss my wife unless she doesn't have her glasses on. Do you wear glasses? No? Perfect eyesight?
Just running through.
Oh, that's not bad. Glasses, no glasses, contacts?
No, I have them.
Oh, you have your glasses with you? Okay.
I choose where I'm reading.
See what you did?
Yeah, what have I done? Oh, no. You wear glasses? Contacts? No? Well, and then we have two sets of glasses. There's a lot of people that need their glasses. So if something happens to you and you don't have your glasses on, or your contacts in, do you have to take your contacts out at night? Okay, yeah. So you're wandering around, you can't see things?
Glasses.
Oh, so you put them on. Okay. We're all your friends here. You can wear glasses and Are we friends here? Yeah, we're all friends. Why not? Okay. Memory fades as the retention interval increases. The longer it is, the more likely that you can't remember exactly what you're talking about. It drives me crazy when they go back, well, 3 years ago on September 3rd, do you remember what this man looked like? And I'm thinking, I don't remember 3 days ago, let alone 3 years ago. Of course I don't remember. What's the probability of remembering that? Post-event information can alter memories of an event, such as talking to other witnesses. A lot of times they will give you information that you didn't have before. Now you've incorporated that into your memory. And because you've incorporated their information into your memory, that becomes your memory as well, even though that wasn't what you remembered. Does that make sense? It's one of the reasons why we try to keep witnesses apart. Because if we let them get together, they will share memories with one another, and all of a sudden that becomes their memory as well. Post-event information that conforms to one's beliefs is more likely to be integrated into the memory. Okay, and this is a problem with African Americans. Really? Yes. So if you don't like African Americans, and you try to remember something about an African American, the probability is that you're going to remember it negatively rather than positively. Does that make sense? So despite the fact that you don't really remember anything negative, you may remember it in a negative manner because you don't like them. I'm not talking about here, I'm talking about the South. Remember, the South was in Jim Crow for an extended length of time. A lot of African Americans and all the all the people that we've seen that were wrongly convicted were African Americans. One of them was convicted in Atlanta, Georgia. 4 people said that he had an alibi. They gave him an alibi. 4 people gave him an alibi. One person was an eyewitness and said that he did it. And he was convicted and put in jail for 75 years. Wow. Is it because he's African American? Is this a problem? How many white people unarmed white people are shot by the police? I don't know. There may be somebody, maybe somewhere, but we hear about African Americans being shot all the time. Okay, so potentially what we are dealing with is post-event information. If it doesn't conform with your beliefs, then you're going to change the information. And if we have a negative opinion about African Americans, potentially that's going to carry over. Now I'm talking about African Americans now, but we can also talk about natives. If people have a negative idea about natives, then potentially that same thing can happen with those select individuals. Right? I'm lucky, I'm white. Nobody, I know everybody loves me. No, they don't. But nobody's going to have a negative opinion about me because I'm white. I don't know, maybe that's not true at all. Anyway, so you see what I'm talking about. Okay, we won't talk about white people anymore. It makes me sad. Viewing photographs of suspects after witnessing a crime can impair an eyewitness's ability to recognize a perpetrator's face in a lineup. Now remember, he's trying to recall cues in his brain as to what this select individual looks like. He's never seen this person before. He saw them for 2 or 3 seconds, or 5 or 6 seconds, or 3 or 4 minutes. Now remember, this lady signed in last night. I had a short conversation with her, and then I saw somebody that looked like her downstairs, and I'm not exactly sure it was her. I didn't memorize her face. It wasn't important enough to me to memorize her face. She's not a student that I've ever had before. She's not a student that I currently have. I've got 184 students. I recognize their names because I do all the grading. I grade everybody, so I remember their names, which is kind of interesting. But I didn't recognize her when I went downstairs, and this was minutes later. This was maybe 20 or 30 minutes later. I didn't recognize her face. The wording of the questions can influence retrieval. Asking what was the man with the mustache doing with the young boy? Now we've cued this individual to be looking for a man with a mustache. And of course, this may affect the memory. He may not have had a mustache at all. But I remember him now as the guy with the mustache. Unconscious transference. Victims may pick from a lineup someone they've seen before who is not the actual criminal. This is a really serious problem. I've got an example right now. 1981, a young lady in Dallas was held at knife point. She was cut and she was raped. 2 days later, she failed to make an identification of the perpetrator. After several days, she came back and picked Larry Fuller out of another pack of photographs. She'd already looked at a pack of photographs, and now she picked Larry Fuller out of that pack of photographs. As it turns out, Larry Fuller was the only picture that was in both packs. So what she was actually remembering was what she saw from the other pack of pictures. She remembered him from the other pack, so she picked him out. Not because he was the perpetrator, but because she saw his picture twice. Everybody else's picture she only saw once, but she saw Larry Fuller's picture twice. And he was convicted, but he was not the perpetrator. I hope I said that. Well, I don't actually say that. Oh, here's Larry Fuller. Larry Fuller is 32 years old. He was raising 2 children at the time. He's working several jobs to put himself through school. He served 2 tours in Vietnam. I know this, you guys don't really recognize how horrible that was, but Vietnam was a situation that most people only served 1 tour in Vietnam. If you served more than 1 tour, then you had to volunteer for the second tour. They sent you over there the first time without volunteering. The second tour was always had to be voluntary. So here we have an individual that was in the Army. This happened in the Marines from time to time, but it never happened in the Army, hardly ever happened in the Army. And here we have a guy that actually went over there twice. He was honorably discharged from the Army. He petitioned the Innocence Project to look at the DNA evidence because he was innocent. He was picked out of the lineup because of the 2 pictures. DNA evidence showed that Larry Fuller couldn't have been the rapist. The DNA was too far off. Fuller was the 186th person exonerated by the Innocence Project using DNA evidence. Okay, so Larry Fuller was not the guy that did it. Why in the world did she pick him out? Because she saw his picture twice. And he was the only face that she saw twice. So she picked him out.
It's not the same thing as like having a long, like a cop keeping someone for too long and they kind of force them to make a confession kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. What she remembered wasn't the fact that he was the guy that did it. She remembered him from the first pack of pictures, the first photo spread. Okay, so here Larry Fuller was finally let out of jail. This was in Texas, and of course Texas doesn't pay you for being wrongly accused. Of course they don't. Experimental methodology, we're going to talk about why eyewitness identification is so inaccurate. The researcher manipulates some of the variables, the presence, for example, the presence or absence of an instruction to participant witnesses, and measures its effects, for example, the likelihood of choosing someone from the lineup. The advantages of this experimental methodology is that the experimenter knows exactly what the witnesses experienced, and this is known as ground truth. It can also establish cause and effect. The disadvantage is that an experiment may be ecologically have no ecological validity. In other words, yeah, this works in an experiment, but it doesn't work in real life. That's what ecological validity has to do with. So yeah, it works if we're doing an experiment. And this is one of the problems with psychology. Sometimes we come up with experimental methodologies that work in theory, of course, but they don't really work in the real world, unfortunately. they don't reflect what's going on in the real world. And some psychologists who don't really live in the real world, they only live in this experimental journal world. They don't live in the real world. They don't recognize this. They see the methodology as accurate, but of course they don't see that it doesn't represent anything in the real world. I know it sounds like I'm complaining about psychologists. Most psychologists actually do live in the real world, but there are a lot of psychologists that are kind of have Asperger's syndrome, and you know, they don't see things for their reality. Archival analysis involves after the fact examination of actual cases, for example, investigating what could have led to mistaken verdicts. That's how we discovered, you know, the Larry Fuller case. Larry Fuller, of course, was the reason that she misidentified him was because she actually saw his picture twice, and that's why she identified him. She got confused in her own mind as to whether he was the perpetrator or why in the world did she recognize him? She'd never seen this man before. She mistakenly thought that if she recognized him, he must be the guy that did it. But that was not true at all. The advantages to archival analysis: it uses real-life situations like the Larry Fuller case. The disadvantages are that they can only document what happened in those cases, and it cannot explain why. And we cannot really carry this information to another case. We can't say, well, in the Larry Fuller case, it was the same picture was in two different photo spreads. We can't say, well, that must have happened in this case as well. We can't say that because we don't know. Field studies combine the rigorous control of the experiment with the real-world setting of archival analyses. Advantage to field studies: they may have more ecological validity than an experiment. So you go to the crime site, you look at the crime site, you look at all the information that the police had, and that is one of the advantages. It has ecological validity. It does deal with the real world. The disadvantage is that because we cannot be certain whether a suspect is guilty or innocent, we cannot distinguish correct identifications of the guilty from incorrect identifications of the innocent. And of course, that's the problem with field studies. When I was at Ashford, we had an excellent criminal justice instructor. She had just finished her PhD, and she would do this. She would create crime scenes, and she would take her students to investigate the crime scenes. And there was a lot of validity to that. It got them used to looking at crime scenes and picking out the pertinent information, overlooking information that wasn't important, finding information that was potentially hidden. And that was very good, but of course the problem was that it wasn't real. None of it was real. It was all manufactured. And that was it had ecological validity, but the problem, of course, was that there wasn't an actual crime. And the reality is that she couldn't have taken them to a real crime scene. That would have been unethical for her to do that. But this is the only way that she had to train. And so she used field studies a lot, and it was actually very, very good for her students. A lot of her students who wanted to go into criminal justice after being at one of these faux crime scenes had just decided that they really didn't want to go into criminology after all, because they were it was grisly. It was there was a lot of negativity. There was a lot of negative information that they were getting that they didn't like. They were remembering things that they didn't really appreciate. They were having bad dreams about the crime scenes. Even though these crime scenes, none of the blood was real, nothing was real. It was all manufactured. Wells in 1978 created a taxonomy to categorize variables. System variables are factors under the control of the criminal justice system. The instructions given to eyewitnesses viewing a lineup, for example, would be a system variable. So you always tell the victims or the individuals that are trying to identify somebody, you always tell them exactly the same thing every time you talk to somebody. You're always giving them the same information. And this is known as a system variable. Estimator variable, factors beyond the control of the justice system and whose impact on the reliability of the eyewitness can only be estimated, the lighting conditions at the time of the crime. The reality is that Can you tell the color of a car at night? Can you do that? Your eyes will adjust. What if it's dusk? The sun has just gone down. Can you still tell the color of a car? Can you tell red from yellow? Yeah, yes you can. You can tell red from yellow. Can you tell dark blue or black? That's a good question. Can you tell white from silver? Can you tell white from cream? I guess it all depends on the color of the car.
Or the lighting up.
Lots of silvers, lots of whites, lots of dark colors. Yeah, so, and that's the question, how much light was there? Did you have enough light to be able to identify this car as being copper colored or yellow? So if it was at night, it's very difficult to tell exactly what color something is. Okay, you've been watching this crime scene. Sorry, let's go the other way. You've been watching this scene for, I don't know, I've had it up here for a couple of minutes. What do we know about the individual that the car was pulling into the driveway, right? And the light shone on a woman. Oh, I identified her as a woman. I know, I should have done that. Okay. So what do we know about the woman? What can you tell me about the woman?
She's wearing a dress.
She was standing there in front of a white background, so we should be able to identify something. What? What do we know about the woman? Did you notice anything about her? Anything at all?
Yeah, she's wearing a dress.
She's wearing a dress?
Yeah.
So she wasn't wearing slacks?
shorts.
Shorts.
Dress or shorts, because her.
All right.
She had long hair,
She had long hair?
I think, brunette.
Dark hair? She had dark hair. Okay. Brunette with a skirt on.
Caucasian brunette with a skirt.
Caucasian, okay. So how do you know she was Caucasian? Could you
She
tell?
could,
Could you tell her skin tone?
well, I could, yeah, it was light, but then everybody could be light in the light.
Okay. Was it
Playing devil's advocate class, come on, help me out.
You're wrong, no. Do we have any other information about this?
Well, she could also be Hispanic, because some Cubans and Dominicans sometimes are pale skinned.
Okay, so she was lighter complexion. We could say she's lighter complexion. Okay. She wasn't African American. She didn't, probably. But there are African Americans that are fairly light complexion.
That's true.
She could have been Hispanic. She could have been Caucasian. Did we notice anything else?
Been barefoot.
She disappeared. We need to know what color her clothes were. Does anybody remember her clothes? The color of her clothes? She had a skirt on.
It's green.
Green.
He says black, and I say green.
Well, we can show it again. We can figure out whether it was actually green
We
or
were just
black.
talking about saying that she might have seemed like she was barefoot still.
Ah, so you
Yeah.
picked out that she was barefoot. That's
Yeah.
interesting. Okay. All right.
Okay, so-
Are you ready? Let's look at her one more time.
Hello.
Well, there's something I didn't notice. Yeah, her top is green. You're right. Her top is green.
That's what I know, it's just a green top, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, she is barefoot. That's like going to be.
Is it possible that this is a guy with long hair?
No,
I
but she
guess
looks to be holding a belly, so she looks like she's pregnant maybe, but that
There
could
you
be
go.
the shadow.
Okay, she's got her hands on her stomach. She's pretty. She's got a checked skirt on. That's the first time I've ever noticed
Checkered
that.
skirt.
Yeah, I thought it was beige actually before, but yeah, you're right. She's got long hair. She probably is a female because we can see that she has the outline of her breasts against the white, so she probably is a female. Unless she's a strangely muscular male or something. Wearing a kilt, which is possible, I guess. The problem is that what we're seeing, we see, yeah, we see the the light shining off her skin. And of course, that tells us that she's white, but she also looks kind of Hispanic. She's relatively darker complexion where there's not such a bright light. Yeah, but she is barefoot. You are correct, she is barefoot. Interesting, isn't it? Or not, I don't know. Okay. Post-diction variables does not directly affect the reliability of identification, but it is a measurement of some process that correlates with reliability. And of course, this is according to Wells et al. In 2006. For example, the confidence that a witness feels for an identification. We're going to identify this girl. Of course, could we possibly identify her? She's not really spinning around the thing like that. That's impossible. But can we identify her? Is she Caucasian? Is she Hispanic? What does her hair look like? Does she have 2 arms? What color is her top? What color is her skirt? Can we get all that information? Is she wearing shoes? Is she wearing boots? Does she have socks on? Now, this is all important information. If we needed to identify this child, or woman, I don't know, it's a guy. Maybe it's a guy, and I don't know the difference between males and females. Is it male or female? What do you think? Male or female?
Female.
Female? How do we know it's a female? I can say it because I don't know. How can we tell?
She's wearing a skirt.
Men never wear skirts. Otherwise, they go in the wrong restroom because the restroom just has an outline of somebody in a skirt, an outline of somebody in pants. So if you're wearing pants, can you go into the men's restroom even if you're a woman? I'm just curious.
She used to ask my dad.
Makes sense to me. Okay, so she's got a skirt on, so obviously she's either a female or she's a male that wears a skirt. Can we tell if it's a female or a male? All women have long hair. Wait a minute, that's not it. She's more slender than a male? Does she have the outline of a female? Well, we can't tell. Her clothes are too loose. But we can tell that she has breasts, or some degree. Okay. Fascinating. Is she wearing boots or is she wearing socks and shoes?
Socks and shoes.
You think it's socks and shoes?
Yeah.
Those are too tight for boots, aren't they? Okay. Interesting, isn't it? Okay. Eyewitnesses are usually better at recognizing and identifying members of their own race or ethnic group than members of another race or ethnic group, and this is termed other race effect. So as a white person, I'm more likely to be able to identify somebody who is also white. Racial attitudes do not appear to be related to other race effect. This doesn't have anything to do with the fact that there are select individuals that are prejudiced against African Americans or prejudiced against natives. It has to do with the fact that we look at select things when we are of a select race. Are we ready for this? I don't know if we are or not. Why does the other race effect occur? Physiognomic variability, a cognitive interpretation. And the other is in-group, out-group differences, a social interpretation. Now here's the kicker. If I have friends who are black, I'm more likely to look at black people differently than somebody who has no black friends. Are you ready for this? Because I'm used to looking at people who are not white. So I look at different things. But if I only live in Indiana and I only see white people, because the black people live over in another neighborhood and I never see those people, then I will look at black people differently. If you're never around white people, then you don't know how to look at them. Are you ready for this? I'm going to teach you how to look at white people. Faces of one race differ from faces of another race in terms of the type of physiognomic variability. White faces show more variability in their hair color. So if you're a white person and you're looking at white people, then you look at their hair color. Does that make sense? We don't look at their noses, we don't look at their ears, we don't look at their eyebrows, we look at their hair color. Black faces show more variability in skin tone. So if we're looking at black people, what we should be reading is what tone of skin they have. How dark are they? What is the degree of complexion? Now this gets really confusing because it all depends on, when we were looking at all those African American faces before, what we were looking at was how bright the light was. That changes the skin tone, as confusing as this is. So if I were African American and I were looking at all of these faces, I wouldn't get an accurate view of how dark or how light these people actually are, because the light is too bright. It's not what I'm used to seeing. So I may misidentify somebody because of the bad photography. Does all that make sense? Okay. So, the more you're around African Americans, the more friends that you have who are African American, the more you learn to read their skin tone, to look at their skin tone. So when you see them, you can immediately identify them because of their skin tone. You're identifying their face, and you're identifying it by skin tone, as confusing as that is. White people, you identify by their hair color. If somebody changes their hair color, if a white person changes their hair color from red to blonde, it throws you off. Emma Stone has just dyed her hair. I told you about Katy Perry dyeing her hair blonde. I didn't recognize her. I would tell you what I recognized, but I'm not going to embarrass myself. She didn't look like Katy Perry. Her face looked different because her hair was blonde, and it's short now. She didn't look like herself. Her face looked different. Now I understand I'm not really looking at her face when I look at her. It's really kind of embarrassing. Anyway, okay, now I've taught you how to look at different people. For eyewitnesses to correctly identify members of the other race, they must focus on the characteristics that distinguish that person from other people of that same race. So if we're looking at African Americans, we need to look at their skin tone. That's how we identify their faces. We identify it by their skin tone. White eyewitnesses should look at skin tone when identifying a black person, while a black eyewitness should look at white hair color in order to identify them. But of course we don't do this. So what do black people look at when they see a white person? They look at skin tone. And of course white people look at hair color or hair texture, and they get all confused. So they misidentify each other all the time. So black people misidentify white people misidentify black people. As confusing as all that is. Does any of this make sense to you guys?
Yeah.
Okay. Research by Goldinger, he and Papish in 2009 monitored eye movement of people as they looked at a series of faces. The researchers discovered that subjects fixated more on distinctive features when viewing own race faces than when viewing different race faces. And if you look at these pictures, is there anything that you notice about anybody in these pictures?
They're all smiling except for the African American. There's one African American.
There's one African American, so we pick him out right away because he's different. But what else do we notice about these pictures?
The white guys are almost.
They're all the same guy. It's all the same picture. So we have 5 pictures of Matt Damon in a football jersey, and we have 1 picture of a black guy. And I hope you picked that out, because their hair is all the same color. That's what we picked out first of all. Okay. Anyway, all right. So now we understand how to identify white people. Social psychologists also explain the problem of identifying other race faces through the in-group, out-group phenomenon. When confronted by someone from our own group, we focus on distinguishing features. When confronted by a person from another group, our initial attention is to identify their group. In other words, when a white person is looking at a black person that they've never met before, they're trying to identify them as black. They're not trying to identify them by what they look like. But if I see somebody that's a white person that I've never met before, what I'm looking at I've already identified them as part of my group, so I don't even have to make an identification. It was like looking at the Hispanic fellow. Where was he? All the way back to here. There you go. It's like looking at this guy. We had to identify what group he was from. Of course, I asked you that question, but at the same time, when you first looked, did you know that he wasn't native? He's Hispanic, so he may have native ancestry, right? If he's Hispanic, if he's from South America or Central America, then potentially he has native ancestry. So let's talk about this right now. Should we identify Hispanics as having native ancestry? They don't, but I mean, you guys are natives, so it's up to you. You can identify them any way you want.
Do we really need the numbers?
I'm sorry?
I said, do we really need the numbers? Yeah, I'm just.
What do you think? Are Hispanics really natives? No? Edison's shaking his head no. They're not really natives. If they don't identify what their tribal group is, then they're not native.
I think they're natives, like you got the Inca, the Mayan, the Azteca,
There's just tons of different
I
groups.
mean,
Those are the major groups, yeah.
like when we go to gatherings of nations,
Sure.
they're out there and they're dancing in their own way.
Sure.
During Standing Rock, when everybody got together, they came and supported Standing Rock in the Sioux. I consider Hispanics as native.
Okay. That's interesting. Somebody from Montana recognizes Hispanics as natives. But how about the guys that live really close to Mexico? I mean, you guys, it's only a couple hundred miles south of here, 300 miles south.
Yeah.
So you guys come in with a lot more Hispanics than Blackfeet up in Glacier. There's hardly any Hispanics in Montana.
My mom is Hispanic.
Well, of course your mom's Hispanic. And you're Hispanic. But there are hardly any Hispanics up there. So you guys are closer to people that are Hispanic. What do you think?
Yeah, Brian,
It
what do
all
you
goes,
think?
it all goes back to history.
I'm sorry?
It all goes back to history. When you look back at the Mexican history, Spaniards were the ones that came and they found them, and then the Spaniards are the ones that taught them their language.
Right, and the Spaniards wouldn't let them identify themselves by their tribe.
Yeah, and they were acculturated into.
Exactly. So it's kind of like them going to boarding school for 200 or 300 years, if you think about it. The Spanish just wouldn't let them identify themselves by their tribe, and they lost all that. There are select individuals who will identify themselves as Aztec or Mayan because they were more isolated than other groups, but the groups that really came in contact with the Spanish, man.
It's non-existent.
I know.
And I think there's just a lot of effort to revitalize a lot of their culture and their language, so those people that are active in revitalizing, reestablish their identities,
Right.
yes, those are the ones that get.
Right, and that's,
I think some other Hispanics would rather not be considered natives.
right, because they haven't identified themselves as natives for several hundred years. Actually, this isn't a question that we need to answer. It's just a fascinating question that I'm trying to get you guys to think about. Okay, sorry. Didn't want to make you think of something you didn't want to think about. I
Well, if they
apologize.
did do that, then would it help people that are going through school too, if they identify as tribal or native, so they can also get funds for school
We
too?
still have that.
Oh, now we're talking about money. Jeez, you remind me of a white guy. Let's talk about money.
Because I know some people that.
No, I know what you're talking about. But
Like,
and-
some people I know, have Aztec and they want to be seen as indigenous and
Right,
get, scholarships, from, like, native, scholarships,
Sure.
and like that, but they can't, because they're not seen as an actual,
right.
tribe.
My ex-wife, my first ex-wife, always claimed to be Chickasaw, which is really kind of interesting. So my kids thought, well, since my mom said I was part Chickasaw,
Yeah.
they're not. Turns out they're not. She was a liar. There was a lot of other things about my ex-wife that you already know about. She's not only a liar, but she's a vicious monster, as it turned out. My kids didn't inherit that, so they're okay. Neither of them stabbed people. Eyewitnesses are usually better at recognizing and identifying, but we already talked about this. Okay, we already talked about this, I apologize. Okay, let's go to the next slide, let's go to the next slide, let's go to the next slide, let's go to the next slide. The evidence for gender effect is not overwhelming, but tends to indicate an own gender bias, at least for women. It's easier for women to identify other women than it is for them to identify other men. Other men, that didn't make any sense. For them to identify men. Okay, so now we've got an interesting situation. Women look at other women more than they look at guys. And this is a point of fact. Males not the same. Males are the opposite. Males look more at women than they do at each other. They may not have a clue what their best buddy is wearing today, or care, or know that he's got a mole on the side of his face. They've never really looked at him that long, but they can tell you exactly what Tiffany's wearing today. They know exactly what Tiffany's wore yesterday, and they can tell you exactly what Tiffany looks like. They know exactly what she looks like. Women are the opposite. Women are always comparing themselves with each other. Okay, now this isn't an absolute. It's not an absolute, but women do tend to look at each other's clothes and gauge whether their clothes are appropriate or whether their clothes are better looking. And of course, Brian doesn't really give a rat's flying flip
They all
about
look pretty
what Johnny's wearing today.
Yeah, we don't care.
Do you look better than Johnny does today?
No, I wish I had that.
Yeah, he's got it. Other eyewitnesses and young children make more errors than younger and middle-aged adults. For example, they are more likely to choose someone from a lineup in which the culprit is absent. So as you get older, these things are more important to you. When you're young, you want to do what you're supposed to do. So young people misidentify people relatively readily, and old people misidentify people relatively readily. Whew. Okay. So it's people your age that are usually the best at identifying people. In recent years, police have begun to incorporate procedures recommended by psychologists and others for interviewing eyewitnesses and constructing and presenting lineups. In 1999, the United States Department of Justice recommended procedures for collecting eyewitness evidence, procedures based on psychological research studies. And of course, one of the problems we have today is that people don't notice anything. Why aren't they noticing anything? Because they're on their cell phones. Yeah, exactly. They're texting or they're checking their phone. 85 times a day. I complained about this yesterday. It's on a commercial, and they say, oh, people check their phones 85 times a day. Of course, I don't check my phone hardly ever. Maybe once a day, maybe twice a day. See if my wife calls.
But they might get lucky and do a photo,
You know,
video.
it all has to do with luck. If I miss my wife's call, I'm not going to get lucky next time I see her. So yeah, you're right.
Rather than taking a picture of the crime, they take a selfie at the
A
crime.
selfie at the crime scene. Exactly. That's a good point. I know, it's kind of funny. They have a new television show on, I can't remember, it's got Kevin in it. What's Kevin? That's not his name. What's his name? Anyway, it's about people looking for criminals and looking on their and communicating with their cell phones. It's really kind of bizarre. I think it's on tonight, as a matter of fact. We'll see how that thing goes. Anyway, people don't really notice things because they're on their cell phones. And this may change the psychology, you know, I keep talking about this. This is something you guys are gonna have to deal with. I'm gonna be dead, so I'm not gonna have to worry about it at all. But you guys are gonna have to, are the next generation of psychologists. People are just not paying attention to things because they're on their cell phones. And so this may change psychology completely, because we're all so self-absorbed that all the rules of the past, that they came up with in the 1940s and 1950s, all that's going to be thrown out the window. You know, Rogers and Freud, all that stuff's going to go out the window. You're going to have to come up with your own theories of psychology, because things are going to change that drastically. We have instant information at our fingertips, and this may change things. People are going to start putting, well, sexting has already changed everything. My goodness, everybody knows what everybody looks like naked because for some reason they posted it on the cloud, and now somebody hacked the cloud, and now we all have pictures of Jennifer, what's her name, the lady that's in the Katniss, whatever. What is that?
Jennifer Lawrence.
Jennifer Lawrence, thank you, okay. She looks like everybody else. She just looks like a white chick to me. Anyway.
Color of her hair.
Yes. Her hair's the same color as everybody else's. My wife, when I first met her, had red hair. She dyed it, and of course, I didn't find that out until later. But now she doesn't dye her hair. She's got gray hair, and she let her hair turn brown. It was really kind of interesting. It really kind of changed her personality. From when she had red hair, she was a boss. She was while she was in the military, she dyed her hair red. One time she dyed her hair red and it turned purple. I know. So she had to go and re-dye her hair because the military won't allow you to have hair color that's not natural. It has to look natural, and purple is not a natural. No, it's not a natural hair color. Not with her anymore. Landmark decision by the New Jersey Supreme Court in 2011, State versus Henderson, also issued in a new set of rules for cases involving eyewitness identifications. The decision lists were more than a dozen factors that judges should consider in evaluating the reliability of eyewitness identification. For the longest time, we didn't even think about this stuff, but now we have a list of a dozen factors. Is this going to take effect throughout the United States? And the answer is we're not exactly sure. And we don't know if the Supreme Court will accept this or not. Odd picture of a man shooting somebody's head off. It's not somebody, of course, it's a dummy that he's blowing his head off. And cocking his gun with one hand, as odd as that may seem. And so the eyewitness, and now that we're talking about eyewitnesses, of course, now that we have come up with strictures as far as eyewitness accounts are concerned, the big question is, was the individual carrying a weapon? And if they were carrying a weapon, that changes everything completely. Because remember, we have weapon focus, where we focus on the weapon and have no clue about anything else. If we're talking about this guy with the shotgun that he's cocking like a Winchester, is he wearing glasses? Are they sunglasses? What color is his hair? What color is the guy's hair?
Platinum.
What is his race? Can we identify his race? Okay, whether the guy's black, Hispanic, or white, we need to identify his hair color, because that's how we tell the difference between one white person and another, is by their hair color. Can you guess how old this guy is? Are you still focusing on his gun? I think that's a shotgun, if I'm not mistaken.
It's from Terminator.
I've never seen a Winchester blow somebody's head off like that. That's kind of odd. Any guesses how old this guy is?
60.
In the 60s. Okay. How can we tell if somebody's old? or if they're just a young guy with white hair? How can we tell the difference?
Their neck.
Does anybody know?
The wrinkles.
I'm sorry?
Look at their neck.
How can we tell if he's, if this is really an old fart or if he's just a young guy with white hair? How can we tell? I mean, there's two features that we can look at. Are you ready for this? Your ears never stop growing. Look how big his ears are. Those are pretty damn big ears, aren't they? How about his nose? Well, we can't really see his nose very well. Noses don't stop growing either. So as if you know anybody that's in their 80s or 90s, they probably have pretty big Dumbo ears and a great big conker. And it's because their noses continue to grow and their ears continue to grow. So you can gauge how old the individual is by looking at their ears and looking at their noses. You may see somebody that's relatively young that just has white hair. And usually they have relatively small features. So there you go. Okay. According to New Jersey State versus Henderson in 2011, when a defendant presents evidence that a witness's identification may be unreliable, the judge must hold a hearing to consider the issues and must give detailed instructions to the jury about the pitfalls of witness evidence. This is in the state of New Jersey. So they don't really trust eyewitness accounts in New Jersey. The judge has to decide whether this is admissible or not. Now, he may decide that it's admissible, but he's not making a judgment as to whether it's accurate or not. But in New Jersey, they have to question, the prosecution and the defense have to come together and decide whether this will be allowed in court or not. And of course, the judge makes that final decision. This decision is expected to have a nationwide impact, and of course that had to do with what we were talking about before. So when we're talking about eyewitness accounts, one of the things we have to talk about is whether there was a weapon or not. Whether the individual is of the same race as the individual they're identifying. Because this can have an impact as to whether it's accurate or inaccurate. Interviewing eyewitnesses in a standard police interview, one relies on the predetermined set of questions with little opportunity for follow-up. This is the way the police will question somebody. It's always the same questions over and over again. We're looking for a social work faculty member, and we're going to interview them on Monday, I think, if I'm not mistaken.
Can I help?
No. We're going to ask them the same questions they asked me. We're going to ask them the same questions we asked everybody. They are standardized questions. The police do exactly the same thing. What do we know about this guy? What do you remember about the guy that I just showed you a picture of? What color is his hair?
Green.
What's his race? What would you identify his race as? Sheldon says African American. So he's an African American. What color is his hair?
Green.
Remember, if he's a white person, we need to identify him by his hair color. Okay. So what's his hair color?
Green.
Green. His hair color was green. Okay. Do we know anything else about him? Was he wearing a baseball cap? He was wearing a baseball cap. I'm sorry?
He had weird eyebrows.
He had weird eyebrows.
Yes, because
They're wearing earrings.
He was wearing an earring. I didn't even notice his earring. I noticed his eyebrows though. He goes all the way across his head. Yeah. And it's painted on. That's the bizarre part. Wait a second. Let me see. Yeah, there we go. Okay. Yeah, he's wearing an earring. You're right. And it says Philadelphia football, so it's a Philadelphia Eagles hat, probably. Even though it's blue and black. The Eagles are green and black, I think. Don't know if it's good. Yeah, he's got the green hair, which is kind of interesting. How many people noticed his green hair before? No? The only way you can identify white people is by their hair.
I was looking at the crime scene.
Oh, you're looking at the crime scene? Okay. Okay, it's time to stop. We'll pick this up next time, and I'll embarrass myself more in the future. So I promise I'll say more stupid things.
When are we gonna have